Now, if you watched the previous video, you will know all about the problems that a terrible owner can cause a club, and for Liverpool between 2007 and 2010, this was the same. And it started when two business partners bought out Liverpool for £218 million back in 2007, with promises of getting the club back to the good old days and a brand new stadium to replace Anfield. But the start of their time in charge was definitely not great. They started off by taking a massive loan from the Bank of Scotland, and instead of using their own money, they plunged the club into mountains of debt, kind of like what the Glazers are doing at Man United at the moment. But as the theme with Gillett and Hicks, problems kept arising. Arguments in the boardroom, which led to the pair's relationship collapsing, turned the ownership really bad. Along with the pair not agreeing with each other, it became clear after multiple years that Liverpool's new stadium was not going to be built. And then it became public knowledge about the amounts of debt the owners had caused. There were riots outside the stadium with the slogan Yanks Out. And this takes us to 2010, where the club was on the brink of financial collapse. As a result of this, the owners were forced to sell the club, of which they argued against. But they were overruled and left in 2010 after a miserable 3.5 years. Also, they bought this guy who was just It is so hard now to not associate Man City with their biggest mistake, and one that may destroy the club, and this is their 115 financial charges. It can all be traced back to 2008, when the Abu Dhabi United Group bought the struggling football club for 200 million. The club had only been promoted to the Premier League in 2002, and their most recent Premier League placements were 8th in 2005, 15th in 2006, and 14th in 2007. So it's fair to say that the club was really struggling before the takeover of Sheikh Mansour and Abu Dhabi. But from then on, the club was turned upside down, with their first Premier League trophy in 2012 after the iconic Aguero last-minute goal. And from then on, they continued to dominate England for the next 12 years. They won 7 more Premier Leagues and mountains of other trophies. But whilst during this time their trophy honours list was filling up, so was their list of financial charges. In 2019, the Premier League itself launched an investigation into their breaches between 2009 and 2018. But it was in 2023 that the case between the Premier League and Manchester City went public, as it became public knowledge about the 115 accumulated financial fair play charges, and that the Premier League had been gathering evidence since 2019. Breaches included failure to provide financial information to the Premier League, breaching the Premier League's profit margins, and non-cooperation with the Premier League's investigations. The case is still ongoing, and potential consequences for Manchester City include points deduction, transfer bans, fines, stripping of Premier League titles, and in the worst case, relegation. In comparison, in November 2023 and early 2024, Everton were punished by the Premier League by an 8-point deduction, and this was only for breaching financial fair play rules twice, nowhere near 115 times, so you can imagine the problems that City could be caused. And now, we move on to Man United.
Now, as a Man United fan myself, I could talk about the problems at the club for hours.
But the blaringly obvious problem comes from above the players and above the manager.
And so, to find the true main problem at Man United, we need to go to the owner's box with the Glazers. And for this, we need to go back to March 2003, when the Glazers bought their first shares in the football club for a 3% stake. And from then on, the Glazer family continued to increase their power and influence over the club, but they didn't quite gain control peacefully. In February 2005, a group of over 400 angry and hostile Man United fans held a protest at Old Trafford against the potential takeover. Yes, that means Man United had been saying Glazers out for over 20 years now. But Man United's complaints would be swept aside as the Glazers bought out these guys' shares and then this guy's shares. This meant that by mid-2005, they had an overwhelming control of Man United with 75% ownership of the entire club, to the fans' disgust. But, as the theme with the Glazers, they continued to increase their control within Manchester United, and this meant that by June 2005, the Glazers had 100% control over the club. And so to celebrate this, on the 29th of June 2005, the Glazers attended their first Old Trafford game since their takeover. But instead of being greeted by a supportive crowd who were happy about their new owners, they were greeted by what can only be described as an angry hate mob demanding the Glazers got out of their club. In fact, the protest was so massive that over 100 police officers could not contain the horde, and it caused Man United's vice chairman of shareholders, Sean Bones, to say the Glazer families are the enemies of Manchester United. So it's clear by now that the Glazers are mortal enemies of Man United fans. But the question is, what actually are they doing bad at the club to cause this level of anger, both in 2005 and leading all the way up to today? Now, their first controversial action was actually when they bought the club. In 2005, they purchased the club with something called a leverage buyout, which means they borrowed £790 million to initially buy the club, putting Man United in a ton of debt before they'd even done anything at the club. Now, this for the Glazers was obviously not a great introduction to the fans. This meant that Man United, previously with £0 of debt, has since paid over £1 billion in interest payments because of the Glazers. And this is money that could be better invested into facilities and players. Since they have owned the club, they have essentially been taking out money or dividends from Manchester United. This is something completely unseen in almost every other major football club. This is because the typical role of an owner is to put money into the club and not take it out. And despite the amount of income that Manchester United generates, the Glazers have still barely reinvested the money into Carrington Training Ground and Old Trafford, hence why both are falling down. Moving on to their next mistake, the Super League. Man United were one of the initial members of the proposed Super League, to this day one of the most despised leagues in world football. And as the internet erupted, the Glazers were among the owners to get slated the most online by football pundits and fans alike. The Super League was only memorable in how unbelievably unpopular it was, and to make matters worse, it was later released that Joel Glazer was one of the 3 key organisers of the Super League. But we are still not done with Man United yet. They are also renowned for their absolutely terrible transfer history over the last 10 years. And to name a few, Antony, Alexis Sanchez, Di Maria, Jadon Sancho, Paul Pogba, Donny van der Beek, Memphis Depay, and the list goes on and on. In fact, since Alex Ferguson left in 2013, Man United have spent over £1.3 billion and have got almost nothing to show for it.